Today I'm talking about my favorite show of all time, The Simpsons. I've never wanted to do a video on The Simpsons. I feel it's just too big of an undertaking. It's my favorite show after all, my point of reference for all comedy. But I made a mistake recently. I thought I'd sit down and watch every Treehouse of Horror. I've never ventured past season 13, so I thought, what the heck? And that was a mistake. Treehouse of Horror XXII's second story, The Diving Bell and the Butterball, has Homer bitten by a Black Widow spider. The spider paralyzes him, making him mute. But here's the funny part. Turns out Homer can communicate through farts.
Oh, Dad!
Now, fart jokes are a tricky bunch. I've had mixed feelings on them over my life, but seeing Homer fart was such a surreal experience. I was shocked. I felt angry, betrayed. I couldn't think of one occasion I had ever heard anyone fart on The Simpsons. Was I misremembering? Was I overreacting? Well, I decided to find out. So let's talk fart jokes. To gain a full perspective, we'll need to find a way to analyze fart jokes objectively, and then track them throughout the show's history. The first thing I set out to do is make a classification system. If we are to determine if the diving bell and the butterball is out of character for The Simpsons, then we need to understand the fart joke, really get inside its gas. After poring over examples, I was able to divide fart jokes into 3 categories, with each arriving at their laughs from different comedic origins. These origins I've named as follows: humor of the gross, humor of the impolite, and humor of the absurd. There is certainly the possibility for fart jokes to share traits of all 3, but I believe their origin will fall into only one. Let's define each. Farts, and the larger category of toilet humor, is most often expressed as gross-out humor. They rely on our personal tensions with cultural taboos. What happens in the bathroom is supposed to be shrouded in a kind of secrecy. Potty talk is taboo, and it's most definitely taboo to bring anything produced in the bathroom outside of the bathroom. It's believed this is partly why children are so obsessed with toilet humor. Kids go into hysterics over the poop emoji, and you wouldn't have trouble finding a popular young children's show that didn't take advantage of fart jokes. Toilet humor is one of the first social taboos children discover, and this usually happens immediately after potty training, at which point discussing bodily functions ceases and becomes discouraged. There is thus a tension created between what adults deem okay and what is forbidden. Children are simply playing with this boundary, and when the tension is broken through, let's say, a fart joke, it brings a lot of excitement. Nearly all gross-out humor uses the same idea. To bring something past what is socially acceptable breaks our tension with the forbidden, and it creates excitement. Let's look at a scene from Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle as an example.
Hey, Clarissa, do you want to play battleships?
Having objects of sexual desire, especially women, take disgusting bowel movements breaks conventional norms. Although it's a guaranteed part of life, it is not something we discuss. It's taboo. We don't like to think of our crush or celebrity icon ever having diarrhea, but they do. So when that tension is broken, it can create comedy. This gross-out humor is, as I see it, the lowest common denominator for a fart joke. This is the inopportune fart. Farting at a moment that is socially impolite, like when we catch people farting on live TV, or if we catch someone farting in public.
Anyway, next week is,
It's usually unexpected and jolting. I'm sure everyone has accidentally farted at an inappropriate moment, and it instills an immediate panic. What do? Did anyone notice? Do I apologize? Do I acknowledge it? Or should I act like nothing happened? Because we know this feeling so well, we could recognize or project it onto others. Of course, a fart is of no consequence, but it's a social taboo, and to see someone else experience this panic brings about Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude.
This humor relies on the perceived embarrassment or theoretical embarrassment of either the farter or witnesses of said fart. I mention theoretical because this includes whoopee cushions and the like. Even if all parties are aware it wasn't actually a fart, it's funny to pretend like it was. What separates this from humor of the gross is that the tension broken is not from acknowledging toilet activities themselves, but from making a social faux pas. It will not elicit any measure of disgust. This fart joke requires more thought and creativity than humor of the gross. There are just certain ways we don't ever expect to do our business or be confronted with farts. And therein lies the humor of the absurd. Take Tim and Eric's poop tube sketch. It uses humor of the gross, but it's at an unthinkable level. A kid demonstrates a device that takes his feces and runs them down his face. Sure, it's extremely gross, but the absurdity that someone would create such a product is what's comical.
It doesn't smell good, but it smells better than it used to.
There is also humor of the impolite in that sketch. The seller, named BM Farts, is such an embarrassing figure. His dad allowed him to sell a product that no one would ever want to be associated with.
I'm BM Farts. My dad said I could sell the poop tube.
And the man's name is BM Farts. The man's entire identity is embarrassing and absurd. Absurd humor can utilize humor of the gross, the impolite, both, or neither. The poop tube sketch is a good example of using the other types of humor in an absurd way. But absurd humor can simply be farts where you weren't expecting them. Bob's Burgers is a good example of this. In that show, Gene has a keyboard that he's very attached to, and although he sometimes plays music, he also has a personal hobby of recording farts and playing them back instead of notes, which is an absurd hobby to have.
Hey, remember my fart from last night?
Be more specific.
Maybe this'll ring a bell.
The absurd fart joke is the most creative and seems to be the most popular in modern media. Before we move on in our investigation, let's discuss two other areas of importance: burps and gender. Burps are, after all, the fart's northern cousin, so we should define how they differ. Both are expulsions of air from an inner cavity, both are considered impolite, but culturally they are not in the same weight class. Farts are associated, and rightfully so, with having a bowel movement. Like it or not, farts are the gaseous components of digestion, and if produced without a covering, can even contain fecal matter. We as humans are hardwired to be disgusted by feces, or should be. This disgust is a protective reaction. It steers us clear of coming into contact with parasites or disease-causing microorganisms. So it's no surprise then that farts rate higher on the gross meter than burps. Burps are not going to give you parasites. Worst they can do is produce a loud disruptive noise or smell. They are merely an inconvenience to present company, and therefore impolite. This is why burps don't mark someone as gross, but slovenly. The Simpsons have used burps consistently for this purpose. From the first season, Barney displays his signature burp to highlight his lack of refinement.
Hey Barney, am I a pig? You're no more of a pig than I am.
Gender is also important to discuss, because although bodily functions are gender neutral, toilet humor isn't. I think we can all agree that culturally, slovenly behavior has been considered masculine. It's the opposite of prim and proper. So burps, which emphasize this boorishness, also emphasize masculinity, or more so, they emphasize a departure from typical portrayals of femininity. If a woman burps, it signals that she's more like one of the boys. She's not the classic female archetype. Although anecdotal, I would also like to mention that I have noticed this attitude towards burps in my personal life. I've seen many women adopt burping as a way to set themselves apart from other girls, to signal being like one of the boys. Farts for women are far more taboo. Since media frequently uses female sex appeal to gain viewership, it's not often we see women and toilet humor combined, unless it's for shock, gross-out humor. In the late 1990s, Candies released an ad campaign where Jenna McCarthy was shown farting in an elevator. This campaign's sole focus was to drum up intrigue from the sole shock of seeing an attractive woman be gross. We can compare this to a fart by Elliot in Scrubs, which based its humor on the impolite, not gross.
I think that blonde girl just farted.
They purposely made the fart very dainty, feminine, as to not put off their audience who viewed Elliot as a sex symbol, which the show routinely enforced. But Scrubs is an outlier. Toilet humor for women typically relies on the gross. Like the Candies ad and the Harold and Kumar scene, the punchline is women do these things but we don't expect them to, and breaking that tension creates humor. The same could be said of men, but femininity is much higher on the polite/clean scale compared to men, so the gross out factor and thus tension is much higher. With female toilet humor, you're guaranteed a bigger shock value, but you run a higher risk of repulsing your audience, turning comedy into disgust, which is why Elliot's fart was so dainty. This also explains the vitriol generated by comedians like Amy Schumer, who rely far too often on gross-out humor. Humor of the gross can polarize your audience, especially when coming from a woman. We now have a classification for fart jokes, have a reasoning for why burps are an equivalent, and an understanding of why fart jokes are different breeds depending on the sex of the flatulator. I think we're finally ready to look at The Simpsons. Up front, I want to state that I am a season 1 through 9 nerd. My knowledge of later Simpsons is not nearly as good. I find them a chore to sit through, so if I've missed any fart-related content, please let me know in the comments. Let's go in chronological order, documenting all mentions of flatulence in The Simpsons, classify them, and then circle back to Treehouse of Horror 22 to finish it off. In just the second episode of the series, we stumble upon our first fart joke. Marge takes the family out for a night at the opera in hopes of stimulating Bart's mind, but Homer and Bart find this quite boring. This is humor generated by playing with a social faux pas, and thus is humor of the impolite. Embarrassment is passed on to those around them, namely Marge, but it's just in good fun, since the opera can seem a little silly with all its ritzy bells and whistles when you know human behavior is naturally unrefined. Moving on, we have I Married Marge. In this flashback episode, Homer and Marge are thinking of names for their firstborn.
How about Louie?
We'll call him Screwy Louie.
Bob?
Slob.
Luke?
Puke.
Marcus?
Mucus.
What about Bart?
Let's see. Bart, Cart, Dart, Eart. Nope. Can't see any problem with that.
This is humor of the absurd. It's simply the inverse of farts where you weren't expecting them. It's a bait and switch. An argument can be made that this doesn't classify as a fart joke at all, as the punchline is Homer's ineptitude, but I'm defining a fart joke as any joke that utilizes a fart in name, sound, or effect in any way. In Fear of Flying, the Simpsons board a plane and are preparing for takeoff, when Marge begins hyperventilating due to her fear of flying.
Marge, what's wrong? Are you hungry? Sleepy? Gassy? Gassy? Is it gas? It's gas, isn't it?
Now this is one of my favorite Simpson jokes, and a good example of how we start to see some overlap. Since Marge is far more refined than Homer, his insistence that she has gas can instill some embarrassment in us for her. How embarrassing it would be to have a panic attack only for our partner beside us to loudly insist it's gas. However, at its heart, I believe it's humor of the absurd. For Homer to associate having gas with a full-blown panic attack is absurd, and that's what makes this joke so funny to me. A handful of episodes later, we have Lisa's wedding. This is a flash-forward episode detailing a prophesized wedding of Lisa's. In one scene, Lisa and her husband-to-be Hugh are sitting down to dinner with her family, when Homer, trying to provide some witty banter, does this.
Pull my finger.
Yes, we have that one in England too, Mr. Simpson.
I said pull my finger.
Homer's far too serious insistence that Hugh pull his finger is, you guessed it, absurd. It makes no sense that Homer would take this so seriously, but that's the joke. In quite possibly the best episode of the series, King Size Homer, we have our fifth fart joke. The episode climaxes with Homer blocking the escape of radioactive gas with his large bottom, and Bart makes this comment.
And I think it's ironic that for once Dad's butt prevented the release of toxic gas. Bart!
This is a pretty clever joke. It derives some of its humor from the gross, since describing Homer's gas as radioactive paints them as quite foul, but this is in fact humor of the impolite, evidenced by Marge's condemnation. It was an inappropriate time to poke fun at Homer, considering he almost died while heroically saving the town. Lisa's sax features a flashback to Bart during his first year of school. Bart is having a difficult time fitting in until he discovers how to make others laugh. I don't think this is supposed to be a punchline for the audience, it's just backstory for Bart's personality. But this is a child breaking the tension of toilet humor, so it's humor of the gross. For the first time, we have a fart joke involving someone outside of the Simpson family.
You want me to turn on the bubbles?
This is implying that Jasper is the one creating all the bubbles. Although this is quite absurd, as no one can produce such volumes of gas, the gag is relying on shock and disgust. For Jasper to have such flatulence, and for Homer and Apu to be surrounded by it, is pretty gross. Keep in mind, up till this point, The Simpsons have never once had any character pass gas. There have only been allusions to a character's flatulence. And here we are, 9 seasons in, and not only is someone farting, but the joke is of the simplest form. A few popular YouTube videos pinpoint Season 9 Episode 2 as the end of Golden Age Simpsons, and this lines up with my own personal tastes, as after the City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, I start the series over. But it's interesting that even if we only track fart jokes, Season 9 is where things begin to change. Wild Barts Can't Be Broken is again another first for The Simpsons. Here, farts are mentioned by name for the first time in the show's history. During a musical number, Nelson sings,
Adults, you strut around like your farts don't stink.
Every time I watch this episode, that line sticks out to me like a sore thumb, but for good reason. This is only the 7th fart joke over 10 seasons, and never once have they said the word fart. It's jarring, but I don't think the writers thought that would be what was funny. I actually think this wasn't intended to get laughs, but was more so used as a way to separate the children from the adults, as this is what the musical number is about. Regardless, it's being counted, and because it's children speaking of farts in order to get a rise out of adults, it falls under the category of humor of the gross. In Monty Can't Buy Me Love, Mr. Burns goes on the KBBL talk radio show Jerry Rude and the Bathroom Bunch.
Monty, I've heard you're a pretty flatulent guy. Any comment on that?
No, now see here. Stop that! Attention wireless listeners, most of the sounds you are now hearing are not being made by me. Do stop! Stop! Won't someone please stop the farting?
Don't worry, folks, he's not dead. I still hear some faint sounds of life.
I think this joke is fantastic. It ventures into the absurd toward the end, but Monty's embarrassment starts this joke from the impolite. The Simpsons are on a roll, because for the 3rd season in a row, we have another first. This time it's the show's first audible fart. Beyond Blunderdome features this historic moment.
Thinking of saying goodbye to gas?
You betcha.
Bart? Well, that shut me up.
Thankfully, this milestone was written more creatively than the previous two. Marge's fart draws from humor of the impolite. It's an embarrassing moment for her, as she tooted immediately after scolding Bart. This joke is elevated by its unexpected nature. Not only is this the first audible fart ever, but it comes from the prim and proper Marge. It uses the female flatulence taboo to its advantage. The opening couch gag of A Tale of Two Springfields has Bart place a whoopee cushion under Homer's seat. When it goes off, Homer reacts apologetically, as if embarrassed. This is another clear-cut humor of the impolite. This whoopee cushion joke is repeated in Season 23, Episode 2's couch gag, and will not receive its own tally.
Step into my office.
Ew, Bart.
It wasn't me.
Right off the bat, this joke uses humor of the gross, and if it stopped after Lisa's reaction, that's all it would be. But the joke ventures into the absurd for the punchline, when Bart tries to pin the blame on someone else despite it being his personal bubble. We're categorizing though based on origin, so this is humor of the gross. The Simpsons would return to breaking new ground in Bart vs. Lisa vs. the 3rd grade. Towards the end of the episode, the word fart is displayed in text for the first time in the show's history. This is a rather innocuous joke, but since it was done for the sole purpose of embarrassing Lisa publicly, it's humor of the impolite.
I can't believe we paid to see a band with Steve Guttenberg, Callista Flockhart, and Farty the crippled robot.
Look who's in my fart, OJ.
This is hard to categorize, as the farts are gross-out humor within the parody, but since it's mocking South Park for relying too often on this type of comedy, the humor is not coming from farts at all. I'm gonna make a judgment call on this one, and not count it as a fart joke. It's a satirical fart joke, making fun of those who stoop to that level. We could make a category for this, but it's the only one of its kind. In Diatribe of a Mad Housewife, Homer briefly becomes a car salesman. While he's leaving two customers to talk over an offer, this exchange happens.
Did that salesman cut one during the test drive?
Yeah, and for some reason he turned on the radio to cover up the smell.
Let's get out of here. I'm not shaking that guy's hand.
I'll be back.
This firmly lands in humor of the absurd, as attempting to cover the smell of a fart with sound makes no sense. In The Mook, the Chef, the Wife, and her Homer, we have a medley of farts. Otto's cassette player breaks, and in an attempt to console him, the school children begin to sing their own renditions of Old MacDonald and Wheels on a Bus.
Don't worry, dude. We'll hook you up with some tunes.
Old MacDonald had a fart. Fart, 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 fart. The farts on the bus go round and round.
At first glance, this seems like humor of the gross, because it's coming from children, but it's more creative than that. The children are indeed making a humor of the gross joke, as children do. But to replace every word with fart or fart noises is an absurd exaggeration of how much kids love toilet humor. On top of that, for them to think this would be a good replacement for Otto's music is absurd. In Waverly Hills 90210, Homer's forced to live in another town so Bart and Lisa can go to a better school. While living in his new apartment complex, his new neighbors come by to welcome him.
Brought you a housewarming present.
The intention of this joke is to show that Homer's new community values lowbrow humor as much as he does, but that doesn't change the fact that this is still gross-out humor for the audience. The Fight Before Christmas has a brief visual fart gag. In it, Homer is shown asleep on the couch reading an issue of Modern Fart Denier. There's even a picture of cut cheese. It is an absurd product and a nice quick joke. It would be 3 more seasons until we got our next fart joke in Yellow Subterfuge.
I buried all my whoopee cushions in the backyard.
What the?
That's not where I buried them.
Come on!
This is the first time we hear Homer audibly fart, and I actually really like this joke. It's a bait and switch, but what really elevates this joke for me is Homer's bewilderment. He's suffering a bizarre case of gas and it's freaking him out. Humor of the absurd. Last on our list is when the Simpsons go to Denmark and throw Grandpa from the Dane. Homer and Bart crack up over a sign that says fart control. We will classify this under humor of the impolite, since it's either seen as embarrassing for Denmark, which is what Homer, Bart, and even Lisa are laughing at, or embarrassing for Homer, Bart, and Lisa for being so juvenile as to find this funny. I'm sure that's not every fart joke in the series. I probably missed a few already.
A fart was detected, Martin denied it, and so was ruled to have supplied it.
Fartzilla.
Can there be any doubt that the culprit is greenhouse gas produced by man?
John Stankworth, fart detective.
But for our purpose, I think this will suffice. If we look at our chart, we can see Season 9 was a pivotal moment. It was here that The Simpsons first stooped to the level of gross-out comedy. Now, I'm no fart joke snob. I think done right, they're hysterical. I use them in my own work. But I try to use them in absurd ways, and The Simpsons, upon tallying up our results, prefer the absurd fart joke as well. They often require the most creativity, and I think comedic payoff correlates positively with creativity. This is why deciphering a joke's origin is so important, because it can be easy to confuse an uncreative gross-out joke for an absurd one. Fart jokes frequently venture into the absurd, but they often don't begin there, and a joke's origin frames the entirety of its humor. So we need to make this clear with one last example before getting to Treehouse of Horror 22. Family Guy does this scene of the dueling farts. It's a play on the popular Dueling Banjos song, and the joke is that it's now farts. This actually happening in a public restroom is bizarre, and seems to be humor of the absurd. But that's not where it began, only where it ended. Full disclosure, I hate this joke. I don't find it funny. However, in Conker's Bad Fur Day, there's a song titled Pooh, and it does something kinda similar, and that kills me every time. The song isn't a direct reference to anything, but resembles music from a noir. It starts off innocently enough, but then farts, some absolutely grotesque, start being incorporated into the music. Both instances use farts in a musical way. Both are riffing on our expectation of the music used, but I'm completely divided on that. The difference is that the Family Guy joke started in humor of the gross. We've all been in public restrooms before. We know how gross they can be, and the fact that anyone would want to compete in farts with the person next to them, which is the basis of the joke, is gross. Like Harold and Kumar, it's getting its laughs first through its grotesqueness. Conker's, however, although it has plenty of gross-out humor, isn't getting my laugh through my revulsion, but by subverting my expectations in an absurd way. It was the last thing I expected to hear. And this is important, because Treehouse of Horror 22 follows the path of Family Guy. Their fart jokes begin in the gross. Treehouse of Horror 22's first fart joke is this.
Let's make her stop how to express my...
Dad?
I think we can say objectively that this fart is one that skews gross. It is not a fart that the writers would have given Marge in Beyond Blunderdome.
Bart? Well, that shut me up.
Lisa reacts appropriately to Homer's flatulence with disgust, and this exact exchange is repeated once more before Homer starts using farts to communicate. The origin of this fart joke is undoubtedly that of the gross. It is only after these first two gross-out farts that the farts start being used absurdly, and I think this taints the entire segment. That initial fart framed the entire running bit, and thus no following fart could escape that lowbrow humor. Homer swinging around as Spider-Man only to fart a web onto some criminals has creativity. It is unexpected and absurd. I can see this joke working if only it hadn't been tarnished by the joke before it. I believe by categorizing fart jokes and examining their history within The Simpsons, we can now truly see why this episode was such a failure. The Simpsons had gone from criticizing the immaturity of South Park to utilizing the gross-out humor it once mocked. Treehouse of Horror XXII is an embarrassing regression in the creativity The Simpsons was once known for. It is an episode in which a dueling farts gag wouldn't feel out of place. To me, it is undeniable proof that The Simpsons at some point lost its identity and became more like Family Guy than its original self. And that saddens me. But at the end of the day, I have to look at myself in the mirror. And now all I see is someone who spent weeks researching and analyzing farts. So what really saddens me is myself.